Why did the room fall silent the moment she was shoved? No one noticed her at first. Not really. She stood in line like everyone else, quiet, patient, unremarkable at a glance. Civilian clothes, neutral posture, no insignia, no demand for space. Just a woman waiting her turn in a military mess hall that smelled of metal trays, burned coffee, and sweat soaked into concrete. And then a shoulder slammed into her arm. It wasn't an accident. Everyone felt that. The force was deliberate, calculated, designed to make her stumble, designed to remind her that she didn't belong. But she didn't fall. Her boots shifted a few inches, nothing more. The tray in her hand stayed level. Water didn't spill. Ice didn't clink. She steadied herself against the counter with the reflex of someone who'd learned long ago how to stay upright when the world tried to knock her sideways. The Marine who shoved her expected resistance or fear. What he got instead was stillness. "You don't belong in this line," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. She turned slowly, looked at him, not with anger, not with surprise, with something quieter, older. Around them, conversations dipped, forks paused midair. The mess hall didn't stop, but it leaned in. She felt it, the attention, the weight of being watched, and somewhere deep inside her chest, a familiar ache stirred. The same one she'd felt years ago in rooms where she'd been underestimated, dismissed, measured by what people thought she was instead of what she carried. She breathed once, deep, controlled. "I'm here for lunch," she said calmly. "The facility is open. I'm within posted hours." The Marine laughed. It was the laugh of someone who had never been told no, and didn't expect today to be different. He stepped closer, too close, the kind of distance meant to shrink someone down. She didn't step back. Inside her, a quieter battle unfolded. Not fear, not doubt, just the familiar calculation. How far will this go if I let it? How much damage happens if I stop it now? She spent a career learning when silence was strength, and when it became permission. The Marine kept talking, louder now, about rules, about warriors, about who deserved to eat and who didn't. She listened, really listened, and that hurt more than the shove. Because she had given her life to this institution, had bled for it, buried friends under its flag, and here it was, reduced to a man mistaking cruelty for authority. Still, she stayed calm. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. He didn't hear the warning in it, or maybe he did and ignored it. His hand closed around her arm. The room stopped breathing. She felt the grip, the pressure, the intent, and with it came something else, memory, gravel under her palms, radio chatter cutting out, orders given in whispers because lives depended on silence. She did not move. He pulled harder this time. Nothing happened. Confusion flickered across his face, then frustration, then something uglier. People whispered. Someone near the back stood up. Others watched with wide eyes, sensing they were witnessing something that wouldn't end cleanly. She felt it too. This wasn't about lunch anymore. This was about who gets to decide someone's worth. When he finally let go, breathing hard, she looked at him with something close to sadness. "You should stop," she said. He didn't. He reached for his radio. That was when someone in the crowd recognized her. A young Marine near the exit stared at her wrist, at the worn black bracelet, at the posture that never wavered. And suddenly his stomach dropped. He'd seen her before, not like this, not quiet, not invisible. In a briefing photo. Stars on her collar. His chair scraped back loudly as he stood. Outside, dialing with shaking hands, he said the words that changed everything. "I think that's the general." Inside, the woman waited. She didn't announce herself, didn't reveal rank, didn't reach for authority like a weapon. She let the truth arrive on its own. When senior leadership finally entered the mess hall, the air shifted again, but this time toward gravity. The Marine who shoved her stood frozen, pale, smaller than he'd been minutes earlier. The woman straightened, not proudly, not triumphantly, just completely. They addressed her properly now, apologized, moved her away from the noise. She nodded, accepted, and as she passed the rows of silent Marines, she felt something unexpected rise in her chest. Not victory. Relief. Because she hadn't needed to shout to be heard. Because the lesson would linger long after the embarrassment faded. Because dignity, real dignity, doesn't demand attention. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it changes the room forever. Why didn't she say who she was when she had every reason to end it right there? The question sat heavy in the room long after the shove, after the shouting, after the silence thickened into something almost physical. She felt it pressing in on her ribs as she stood there, arms still warm where his hand had been. Around her, Marines shifted their weight, eyes flicking between her and the man who had decided, without knowing anything about her, that he owned this space. She could have spoken then. One sentence, a name, a rank, the truth would have landed like a hammer. But she didn't. Not because she was afraid, not because she doubted herself. It was because she had learned the hard way that power used too early teaches nothing. It only humiliates, and humiliation, she knew, had a way of curdling into resentment. So she stayed quiet. The Marine Hutchkins paced a step, adrenaline buzzing under his skin. He felt the eyes on him now. He felt the moment slipping. Bullies lived on momentum and his had stalled. The woman wasn't shrinking. She wasn't arguing either. She was just there, solid, unmovable in a way that made his chest tighten. "You think you're special," he snapped, trying to claw the narrative back. "You think quoting regs makes you untouchable." She met his gaze again, steady, calm. "No," she said, "I think rules exist for a reason." That calm voice did something strange to him. It didn't challenge him the way defiance usually did. It didn't provoke. It didn't beg. It simply stated reality as if she were explaining gravity. Inside her chest, another memory surfaced, one she hadn't invited. A briefing room overseas. Fluorescent lights humming. A junior lieutenant being dressed down for a mistake that had cost a life. Not because the lieutenant was cruel, but because no one had corrected him early when it mattered. She swallowed. This wasn't about punishing Hutchkins. Not yet. This was about seeing who he chose to be when confronted with restraint instead of fear. He chose escalation. "You're done here," he said, voice rising again. "I'm calling MPs. You don't move, you're in cuffs." Around them, the mess hall had reached a kind of suspended animation. Food went cold. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. Even the bravest among the junior Marines felt it, that sixth sense that this was no longer entertainment. This was a line being crossed, and they were witnesses whether they wanted to be or not. She watched him raise the radio. And for the first time since he'd shoved her, something inside her shifted. Not anger. Resolve. She had given this institution 20 years of her life. She had believed in it enough to stay when it broke her, when it took people she loved, when it asked more than it should have. And she would not let one man turn authority into a blunt instrument without consequence. "Sergeant," she said softly. He hesitated just for a fraction of a second. His thumb hovered. That hesitation told her everything. "You're about to make a decision you can't undo," she continued. "And you're making it in front of people who will remember." He scoffed, but it rang hollow. "You threatening me now?" She shook her head once, slow, almost gentle. "No, I'm giving you time." Time, the thing she'd learned mattered most in combat and command. Give people just enough of it to choose right. His face flushed again. Pride flared brighter than caution. "You don't get to lecture me," he snapped. "You don't get to." She raised a hand. Not high, not dramatic. Just enough. And somehow the room obeyed before he did. The words died in his throat. He didn't know why he stopped speaking, only that something ancient and instinctive told him to. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, denser. It carried weight without volume. "You believe authority comes from your rank," she said. "That's your first mistake." Several Marines felt a chill crawl up their spine. This wasn't policy talk anymore. This was leadership, real leadership, being dissected in real time. She stepped half a pace closer, not invading, not aggressive, just present. "Authority comes from trust," she continued, "from restraint, from knowing when not to use force simply because you can." He stared at her now, truly staring, confusion mixed with anger. Something about her didn't fit any box he knew. Civilians didn't talk like this. Spouses didn't hold themselves like this. Contractors didn't radiate this kind of command. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The question echoed, louder than he intended. Across the room, a young Marine named Westbrook felt his stomach drop again. He'd been watching her the whole time, heart hammering. He noticed things others missed, the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she never once looked for help. He'd seen that posture before. On a projection screen, in dress blues, with stars catching the light. "Oh no," he whispered. The bracelet on her wrist caught the overhead lights as she shifted. Scuffed, worn, names etched small enough that you had to know what you were looking for. Westbrook pushed back from the table, pulse racing. His friend grabbed his sleeve. "Sit down," his friend murmured. "Don't get involved." But Westbrook was already standing. Because if he was right, this wasn't just ugly. This was catastrophic. Inside, Hutchkins keyed his radio despite himself. The sound of static cracked through the silence. That did it. The woman's expression didn't harden, but it closed, like a door gently, firmly shut. "Lower the radio," she said. Not loudly. Not angrily. Commandingly. He froze. Every Marine in that room felt it. The shift, the invisible line snapping into place. "You don't get to order me," he began. "I do," she replied, "just not the way you think." That was when Westbrook bolted for the exit. Outside, air burned his lungs as he dialed with shaking fingers. Each ring felt like a lifetime. Inside, she waited again. Because now it wasn't about teaching Hutchkins. It was about protecting the people watching, about showing them that leadership wasn't loud, wasn't cruel, wasn't fragile. Minutes stretched. The radio crackled uselessly in Hutchkins' hand. His confidence leaked out of him in visible increments. Sweat beaded at his temples. His subordinates shifted, no longer certain whose side they were on. She saw it all. She also saw herself, years ago, standing in another line, figuratively this time, being dismissed by someone who thought her gender negated her experience. She remembered swallowing that insult, carrying it forward, turning it into something sharper but cleaner. She had promised herself she would never let that kind of rot spread unchecked if she ever had the authority to stop it. Footsteps approached, purposeful, multiple. The room straightened instinctively. Senior voices cut through the tension. "What is going on here?" Hutchkins spun, relief and terror colliding on his face. The woman finally exhaled. Not because she was safe, but because now the lesson could begin. She turned toward the approaching officers, not as a victim, not as a civilian, but as someone who had waited long enough. And still she hadn't said her name. Not yet. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a leader can do is let others reveal themselves first. And everyone in that room, whether they knew it or not, was about to learn what true authority looked like when it finally stepped forward. Why did the officers stop the moment they saw her face? The question rippled silently through the mess hall as boots crossed the threshold and command presence flooded the room. Conversations that had already died now felt impossible, like sound itself had been disciplined into stillness. Trays sat untouched. Chairs were half-turned. Every Marine felt the instinctive pull to stand straighter, to disappear and be seen at the same time. The first officer through the door, a lieutenant colonel, opened his mouth to speak. Then he saw her. Not her clothes, not where she stood, her face. Color drained from his expression so quickly it was almost imperceptible, but to anyone who understood command, it was unmistakable. His spine stiffened. His breath caught. The words he'd prepared vanished. He stopped. So did the captain behind him. So did the master gunnery sergeant, who had entered with the confidence of someone used to fixing problems with volume. Hutchins noticed the shift before he understood it. He followed their gaze, looked back at her, really looked this time. The way she stood now was different, not louder, not prouder, but settled, like someone who had finally stepped into alignment with themselves, the kind of stillness that came from certainty, not defiance. The lieutenant colonel swallowed. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "is there an issue?" The word ma'am hit Hutchins like a slap. His head snapped back to the officer. Confusion cracked his features. Officers didn't say ma'am to civilians like that. Not with that tone. Not with that posture, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders squared, eyes steady but deferential. She didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room instead, took it all in. The faces, the tension, the young Marines pretending not to stare, the older ones already guessing the outcome and bracing for fallout. She felt something twist in her chest. This wasn't how she'd wanted this moment to happen. "Before we proceed," she said quietly, "I want to be clear about something." Her voice carried without effort. It didn't need amplification. "No one here is in trouble for standing and watching," she continued. "You were placed in an uncomfortable position. That responsibility is not yours." Several Marines exhaled, without realizing they'd been holding their breath. Hutchins felt his mouth go dry. She turned to him then. "Fully, Sergeant," she said. Not harshly, not kindly, accurately. He stiffened reflexively. Training kicked in where ego faltered. "Yes, ma'am," he replied automatically, then froze, realizing what he'd just said. The silence deepened. "You believed you were enforcing order," she said. "Is that correct?" He nodded, throat tight. "Yes, ma'am." "Did I threaten you?" "No, ma'am." "Did I raise my voice?" "No, ma'am." "Did I disobey a lawful order?" His jaw clenched. "No, ma'am." She let the words settle, let the pattern form on its own. "Then explain to me," she said, "why you felt justified placing your hands on me." Every eye in the room fixed on him now. This was no longer a confrontation. It was an examination. Hutchins' mind scrambled. A dozen answers surfaced, none of them good enough. He thought of rank, of rules, of the unspoken hierarchies he'd grown comfortable with. "I thought," he began, then stopped, because for the first time he heard how thin that sounded. She waited. That was the worst part. Not anger, not punishment. Expectation. "I made an assumption," he said finally, voice barely audible. She nodded once. "Yes," she said, "you did." She turned back to the officers. "For context," she continued, "I was invited to this installation for a closed briefing at 1600 hours. My credentials were cleared this morning. I arrived early. I chose to eat here." A pause. "I did not choose to be tested." The lieutenant colonel felt heat creep up his neck. "Ma'am, I apologize. This should never have." She raised a hand again, that same small, contained gesture. "Apologies are not the same as corrections," she said. "I'm interested in the latter." The master gunnery sergeant stepped forward, jaw tight. "Ma'am, permission to address the issue directly." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring, then nodded. "Granted." He turned to Hutchins. His voice was low, controlled, and dangerous in its restraint. "Sergeant, you will step back, now." Hutchins obeyed instantly, boots scuffing the floor. The room watched him shrink, not physically, but internally. The confidence that had filled him minutes earlier had collapsed under the weight of exposure. She felt something unexpected then. Not satisfaction. Grief. Because she knew how moments like this echoed, how a single unchecked belief could harden into a habit, how habits became culture, and how culture decided who stayed silent and who was heard. She addressed the room again. "Rank," she said, "is not a weapon, it is a responsibility." Her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, meeting faces one by one. "When we mistake authority for dominance," she continued, "we lose the very people we claim to protect." No one spoke. Even Hutchins listened now. She took a breath, felt the old weight settle briefly on her shoulders, the burden of command, of knowing your words could change trajectories you'd never witness again. "I will handle this matter formally," she said to the officers. "But understand this, what happened here today is not about one person." She gestured subtly to the room. "It's about what we tolerate when we think no one important is watching." Her gaze flicked back to Hutchins. "And what we reveal about ourselves when they are." The officers nodded, sharp, immediate. "Yes, ma'am." Only then did she do it. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced her identification, held it up just long enough. The stars caught the light. Gasps rippled through the mess hall, quiet, stunned, involuntary. Hutchins felt his knees weaken. The woman he'd shoved, the one he'd threatened. Outranked everyone in the room. She slipped the ID away as if it were nothing. Because to her it was. She didn't need it to be seen. She turned toward the exit, officers falling into step behind her. As she walked, she felt the weight of eyes on her back. Not judgment now, not curiosity. Reflection. And somewhere deep inside, a small, fragile hope stirred. That maybe, just maybe, this moment would live on not as a scandal, but as a turning point. Why did it feel heavier now, after the truth was known, than it had when she was invisible? The corridor outside the mess hall was quieter than it should have been. No chatter, no hurried footsteps, just the soft echo of boots and the low hum of fluorescent lights. The officers walked beside her now, slightly behind, unconsciously adjusting their pace to match hers. No one spoke. She welcomed the silence. Inside her chest, the adrenaline was finally draining, leaving behind something more complicated. Exposure always did that. When the mask came off, when the rank was revealed, people assumed the hardest part was over. They were wrong. The hardest part came after, when you had to live with what your presence uncovered. She felt it in the stiffness of the lieutenant colonel's shoulders, in the way the master gunnery sergeant kept glancing at her, as if searching for the right words and finding none. They entered a small conference room, windowless, neutral, the kind of room where careers bent quietly instead of breaking loudly. The door closed. She remained standing. "Sit," she said gently, noticing how quickly they obeyed. She didn't sit herself, not yet. Because this wasn't about procedure. It was about accountability, and that required clarity. "You handled the arrival promptly," she said to the lieutenant colonel. "That matters." Relief flickered across his face, brief and undeserved. "But," she continued, "the incident occurred long before you arrived." He nodded, "Yes, ma'am." "Which means we need to talk about environment," she said, "not individuals." The master gunnery sergeant shifted in his chair. He'd seen these conversations before, knew where they led. Still, something about her tone unsettled him. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't angry. It was disappointed. Disappointment carried farther. "I've read the climate reports from this installation," she said. "On paper, everything looks compliant, efficient, functional." She paused. "Paper lies." No one argued. "Tell me," she said, finally taking a seat, "when was the last time a junior Marine felt safe correcting a senior without consequence?" Silence. The lieutenant colonel opened his mouth, then closed it again. She nodded, "That long then." She folded her hands on the table. They noticed the faint scar along her knuckle, old, poorly healed. "I didn't intervene today because I was offended," she said. "I intervened because what I saw would have followed that sergeant home, into his leadership, into his decisions." Her voice softened, and into someone else's breaking point. The master gunnery sergeant cleared his throat. "Ma'am, Hutchkins will be disciplined appropriately." "I'm sure," she replied, "but discipline isn't the same as understanding." She leaned back slightly. "Tell me about him." The lieutenant colonel hesitated, then spoke carefully. "He's capable, strong performer, aggressive." She raised an eyebrow. "Aggression isn't leadership," she said. "It's impulse." He nodded again, chastened. "He wasn't trained to recognize authority unless it looked like him," she continued. "That's not entirely his fault." The room tightened. "But it is yours to correct," she added. They absorbed that quietly. She stood then, walking toward the far wall where a small plaque hung, installation motto etched in polished metal. Words about honor, respect, unity. She touched it lightly. "These words," she said, "only mean something when they cost us comfort." She turned back. "I don't need a report that tells me you fixed a problem," she continued. "I need to know you understand it." The lieutenant colonel met her gaze fully now. No defensiveness, no posturing. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time he meant it. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good." The meeting ended without ceremony. No dramatic threats, no raised voices, just clear expectations set where excuses used to live. As she stepped back into the corridor, the weight returned, not heavier but different, more personal. Because now came the part no one saw. Later that evening, alone in her temporary quarters, she removed her jacket and placed it carefully on the chair. The room was sparse, standard issue, functional. She preferred it that way. She sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on her knees, and finally allowed herself to feel. The shove replayed in her mind, not the impact but the intent, the assumption, the ease with which he'd dismissed her humanity. She'd faced worse. Combat had taken more from her than pride ever could, but this cut differently, quieter, closer. She pressed her thumb against the scar on her knuckle. She thought of the first time she'd been underestimated, then the second, then the 100th. Each time she'd told herself it didn't matter, that results would speak. They did. But results didn't erase moments like today. A knock came at the door. She considered ignoring it. Then sighed, "Come in." The door opened slowly. A young Marine stood there, nervous, hands clasped too tightly. "Ma'am," he said, "permission to speak." She recognized him instantly. "Westbrook." "The one who ran," she said. His ears reddened. "Yes, ma'am." She gestured to the chair. "Sit." He did, awkwardly. "I just wanted to say," he struggled, "thank you." She studied him, really looked. "For what?" she asked. "For not destroying him," he said quietly, "and for not ignoring it either." Something in her softened. "You saw what was happening," she said. "You chose to act, that matters." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I was scared," he admitted. "So was I," she replied. His eyes widened. She smiled faintly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she said. "It's deciding what matters more." He stood to leave, straighter than when he'd entered. When the door closed behind him, she leaned back and exhaled. Outside, the installation settled into night. Lights dimmed, voices faded. And somewhere in the mess hall, chairs were being stacked, floors cleaned, traces erased. But the moment itself, that would linger, not as shame, but as a quiet reckoning. Because sometimes, the most powerful battles aren't fought on distant ground. They're fought in ordinary rooms, over ordinary choices. And they reveal exactly who we are when we think no one important is watching. Why did the quiet feel louder than the confrontation ever had? The bass slept lightly that night, the kind of rest that never fully settles, where engines hum in the distance and radios crackle faintly through concrete walls. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths the way she had learned to do years ago when sleep became unreliable. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. It didn't help. The incident replayed again, not in fragments this time, but as a whole. The shove, the eyes on her, the moment she chose silence instead of force. People assumed restraint came easily to someone at her level. They were wrong. Restraint was a discipline learned through mistakes, through moments when anger had cost her something she couldn't recover. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall. Tomorrow she would brief senior command. The installation review would continue. On paper, everything would move forward. That was how the system survived, by compartmentalizing. But she had learned long ago that unexamined moments festered. She rose quietly, pulled on a sweatshirt and stepped outside. The night air was cool, sharp with the scent of fuel and damp earth. She walked without direction, letting her boots find a rhythm. The parade ground stretched wide and empty under the lights, flags barely stirring. This was the part of leadership no one trained you for. The part where you asked yourself if you'd done enough or too much. She remembered another night like this, years earlier, half a world away. A forward base carved into rock. A decision she'd made with incomplete information. The mission had succeeded. 2 people hadn't come back. She carried that with her still, not as guilt exactly, more like a shadow that lengthened in quiet moments. Back then she'd learned something essential. Leadership wasn't about being right. It was about being responsible. She stopped near the edge of the field, hands in her pockets, eyes lifted toward the dark sky. Somewhere above, aircraft moved unseen. She wondered who was inside them. Young, tired, trusting the people who'd planned their route. Trust was fragile. By morning, rumors had already spread. They always did. Not the full story, never that, but pieces. A general in the mess hall, a sergeant disciplined, a moment that people whispered about in lowered voices. She heard it in the cadence of greetings, felt it in the way Marines straightened when she passed, unsure whether to fear her or respect her. Neither was what she wanted. She met with Hutchkins that afternoon. No audience, no spectacle. Just a table, 2 chairs, a closed door. He entered stiffly, eyes forward, hands clenched. He didn't sit until she did. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me." He hesitated, then spoke. "Because I disrespected you. Because I put hands on a superior officer." She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "Those are outcomes. I'm asking about causes." He frowned, thrown. She waited. After a long moment, his shoulders sagged. "Because I thought I could." The honesty surprised both of them. She nodded. "That's closer." She leaned forward slightly, not looming, engaging. "Tell me what you saw when you looked at me," she said. He swallowed. "A civilian or someone who didn't belong." "And what made you decide that?" she asked. He struggled. "I don't know, you didn't look like." He stopped himself. She finished the thought for him, like authority. He nodded, ashamed. "That image," she said quietly, "was built for you over time, reinforced, rarely challenged." She let that settle. "You're not here because you're irredeemable," she continued. "You're here because you're responsible for unlearning something before it hurts someone else." His eyes flickered up to hers. For the first time there was no defensiveness, only uncertainty. "I don't want to be that leader," he said. "I know," she replied. "If you did, this conversation wouldn't matter." She outlined consequences, measured, appropriate, firm, but she also outlined expectations, education, mentorship, accountability that didn't end with punishment. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "I'm sorry, not because of your rank, because of what I showed." She held his gaze. "That's the right reason," she said. After he left, she sat alone for a long time. This was the work. Not dramatic confrontations, not authority wielded like a blade, but slow corrections, quiet recalibrations, the hope that people would choose better when given the chance. That evening, she recorded a short message to be shared across the installation, not about the incident, about leadership, about restraint, about courage, about the cost of assumptions. She didn't name herself. She didn't need to. The words spread anyway. Later, as she packed to depart, she paused at the mirror, studied the woman staring back, the lines earned, the weight carried. She thought of the young Marines who'd watched her in the mess hall, of Westbrook, of the ones who would never know her name but might remember the feeling of that moment. She zipped her bag. Outside, engine started, a transport waiting. As she walked toward it, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Not loud, not naive. Just enough. Because sometimes change doesn't arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a choice made under pressure, a lesson learned without humiliation, a leader who refuses to confuse power with worth. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay long enough to teach. Why did she hesitate at the top of the ramp, when everything behind her was already complete? The engines idled, steady and patient, waiting for a signal she hadn't given yet. Dawn was just beginning to thin the night, turning the horizon the color of steel washed clean. She stood there with her bag slung over one shoulder, boots planted, feeling the strange pull of an ending that didn't feel finished. She had done what she came to do. The briefings were complete. The conversations had been had. The corrections were in motion. And yet, she looked back once more at the installation. Rows of buildings waking slowly, flags lifting into the morning air, Marines moving with purpose toward another ordinary day that would never feel quite the same. She hoped. Inside the aircraft, the crew waited without comment. They understood this kind of pause. Everyone who served long enough learned that leaving was rarely clean. You carried places with you, sometimes heavier than the gear. She climbed the ramp and took a seat near the bulkhead. As the doors closed and the engine spooled up, she rested her head back and finally let her eyes close. Sleep came, not deep but honest. In it she saw flashes, not of the mess hall, not of Hutchkins, but of smaller moments, quieter ones. A young woman years ago, standing in formation for the first time, boots too new, spine too rigid, wondering if she would ever be enough. A briefing room where her voice had been mistaken for interruption. A mission where hesitation had almost cost everything, and another where restraint had saved lives. She woke as the aircraft lifted, the subtle pressure change grounding her in the present. Below her, the base shrank into geometry and shadow. She wondered how the story would be told. Stories always found a way to mutate, to simplify, to assign heroes and villains where reality had only people and choices. She hoped the version that survived wouldn't center on her rank or the spectacle of the reveal. She hoped it would center on the pause, on the moment she chose not to end it quickly, on the space she created, for reflection instead of reaction. Later, at another installation, another briefing, someone mentioned it in passing, a rumor, a cautionary tale, a reminder. She didn't say who she was, someone said quietly. She let him show everyone first. The room went still. That was enough. Weeks passed, then months. She returned to her routines. Early mornings, long days, decisions that never made the news, names she carried with her in the quiet hours. Leadership was like that, an accumulation of unseen weight borne so others could move lighter. Occasionally, an update crossed her desk, climate surveys shifting, mentorship programs strengthened, a sergeant requesting reassignment to instruction, citing growth. She never smiled at those notes, but she breathed easier. One afternoon, she received a handwritten letter, unusual, personal. It was from Westbrook. He wrote about promotion, about how he'd corrected a peer once and been listened to, about how fear still showed up but didn't get to decide anymore. At the bottom, he wrote a single line. "I didn't know leadership could be quiet until I saw it." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her drawer. Years from now, she would retire quietly. No grand ceremony, no speeches that captured the truth of what she'd given or what she'd learned. She would walk away the same way she had walked into that mess hall, without announcing herself. And that felt right, because the real measure of her service wasn't the authority she'd held. It was the moments she'd chosen not to use it. Somewhere, someday, a Marine would stand in a room where someone smaller was being dismissed, overlooked, tested. And maybe, just maybe, they would remember the feeling of watching a situation unfold without force, of seeing dignity hold its ground without shouting, of understanding that restraint wasn't weakness. It was discipline. She hoped that Marine would pause, would choose better, would understand that power doesn't need to be proven, it needs to be guided. As the sun dipped low at the end of another long day, she stood at her window, watching light fade into shadow. The world outside was unchanged, and yet it was, because change rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, through people willing to absorb discomfort so others don't have to, through leaders who understand that respect cannot be demanded, only earned and protected. She turned away from the window and prepared for tomorrow, still carrying the weight, still choosing restraint, still believing that the smallest moment often shape the strongest futures. And somewhere in the space between silence and action, her lesson remained. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.